Years ago, I had as I got started with technology, this was back in the 80s. There were some interesting things. Uh, that was back when the internet was kind of the wild, wide west, and you could find these things online that were gags, especially around April Fool's Day, or computer gags. And my wife had a coworker who was not very computer literate, and she wanted to play a prank on her. Now, there's several things you could do. You could have one that if you hit a certain key, your screen would turn upside down and you couldn't get it back unless you did another keystroke, but you didn't know what it was. My favorite though was this one. I had to go find it on YouTube now, but you have something like hey, right here. Suddenly, as you're reading it, typing something, you get so happy to all of a sudden it disappears, and you don't know what happened to it. You didn't hit anything; it just happened. And you go, "What took place?" Well, think about that for a moment. We're gonna look at that. What happens if everything starts to disappear? What if you start having degradation? What if things begin to move away and you don't have a clue what the Bible really did say? That's what we've been looking at in this series. But more than that, we're going to talk about today the Old Testament. We've had a preoccupation in the last few weeks with the text of the New Testament. We showed you things like in Matthew chapter 6, the problem with the Sermon on the Mount and the ending with that, or in Mark chapter 16, the ending with that, or where the Ethiopian nobleman actually does a uh, a confession before he's baptized, and the word, and how all that takes place. So we spent a lot of time doing that. I understand that. But at the same time, we came up with 4 different rules about how things are put together in our when we read a Bible. How did they determine that was the original text? And those rules were very simply: the more difficult the reading, the more preferred it is. Why? Because we tend to want to simplify things, not make them more difficult. And so a change will take place to make it more simple, but difficult is preferred. The quality is more important than the quantity, because you have 1,500 bad copies and only one good copy. You better trust the one good one and not 1,500 bad ones, as we talked about last week. In parallel passages, differences are preferred as well, because we try to snap everything together. We want everything to line up. If Matthew said one thing, we want Luke to say exactly the same thing. And so there is this temptation to straighten all the crooked pictures in the text. And that happens from time to time. And the shorter is better than the longer, because we tend to add things to explain what's going on in our world rather than take things away. And so those rules we've kind of gone through before, but we didn't pay a lot of attention to the Old Testament. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. Probably one reason is because as Christians, we tend to spend more time in the New Testament, and we don't spend as much time in the Old Testament. I told you before that when I've got a master's degree in Old Testament studies, but when I went out to the interview for a preaching job, I had an elder say, "Why did you do that? Nobody reads the Old Testament anymore." I found that kind of fascinating, that viewpoint of the popular church at that time. And so we don't pay a lot of attention to it. So we just think it's there. And because it's old, it's more reliable. After all, things that are old, we think if they're old, they must be okay, because nobody's messing with anything old. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, as we're going to see, but not as much in the Old Testament. The question though, why? Why does why do we pay that much attention to it? I guarantee you, if you read books on how the Bible came to be, the Old Testament ranks about half a chapter. Almost all of it is about New Testament things. But there are several reasons, I think. One is we don't have as many manuscripts, and there's some good reasons we're going to describe for that. The New Testament, we have about 25,000 plus manuscripts. We don't have anywhere near that many in the Old Testament. And I'm going to tell you also, because Greek is easier to learn in college than Hebrew. There's not that many people who study it. We had a Friday secretary here one time that her son got a doctorate degree in ancient Sumerian languages. What do you do with that? You know, you don't go door to door and say, "You need anything read Sumerian?" You know, and he ended up mowing yards most of the time, and he has his doctorate in this very obscure thing. That's the problem with the Old Testament. We go, but it's harder to read in the original language, so a lot of people don't want to study that, and that's true as well. But there are fewer manuscripts to study. For instance, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of some. The Aleppo Codex is from the 10th century AD. I want you to pay attention to the dates because that's going to become important. This used to be complete. It used to have all of the books of the Old Testament, Genesis to Malachi, all of them. It was a complete Old Testament. The only problem was it's not complete anymore. The reason it's called the Aleppo is because of this place up here in northern Syria, not far from the Turkish border. In the last 10 years, Aleppo has basically been destroyed by civil war. Some of the great antiquities of the time have been destroyed. Things that have been there for 2,000, 3,000 years, which is a real shame that that's happened. But the scroll, the codex, the Aleppo Codex, was kept at the Beth Nasser synagogue in Aleppo, and had been there for 1,000 years almost. Curated, taken care of, protected, all of those things. Well, in December of 1948, after the United Nations declared Israel its own sovereign country, in the Arab world, there broke out all kinds of rebellions and riots, much like you see today in the newspaper. And one of the things that happened, the Arabs put a torch to the synagogue. And when they started sifting through the ruins, they began to find charred pieces of a manuscript that they realized were very old. But a lot of it had been destroyed by the fire. And so they gathered up what they could, and they smuggled it out of the country and took it to Jerusalem, where the Hebrew University has it today. Now it's missing 25% of the Old Testament. It pretty much has the prophets and pretty much has the 5 books of Moses. A lot of the other things are gone for that reason. The Leningrad Codex has the prophets, and it's from 916 AD. It's an excellent manuscript as well. It's kept in Leningrad. It's gone back to its pre-Russian name of St. Petersburg now, but it has an interesting viewpoint. I want you to look at this because this is going to come back into play as we go through it. Notice how nice and precise the columns are. Isn't that great? What do you think it took to make that happen? What's that? A computer from 915 AD. All right, it's interesting. There's a reason for that we're going to talk about in a moment. But it has the entire Old Testament, and part of it comes from 1000 AD. But look at that. Cairo Codex is from the 11th century, has what's called the former and latter prophets, a little bit of nomenclature, if you will. In the Hebrew rendition of the Old Testament, they have two different divisions. They had the former prophets and the latter prophets. The former prophets were Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Those are the books of the former prophets. Then they had the latter prophets, which is what we would consider our regular prophets today. And so those things were all in there. And so this is what it contains there. The British Museum has a codex that looks like this. Notice again the nice columns that are there and the space in between them. And we're going to come back as well with that one. It is from the 10th and 11th century. It has the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And so this is a good one as well. A lot of these now have been digitized and they are online if you want to go learn 3 years worth of Hebrew to read them. So it's all there, though. It can be done. But compared to the thousands of the New Testament, why are there so few? Why did that not happen? Why don't we just have volume upon volume upon volume? After all, we've gone through a lot longer time from the Old Testament than from here. And there's a good reason for it. And the reason is they had an extreme reverence for the Hebrew text. The scribes that inscribed this, they had this interesting problem. They said when you write down the words, when you put the words down on paper, those are not ink on paper. Those are the words of God. I want you to think about how that changes what you might be doing. These are the words of God. If you were to mess this up, you might lead someone astray. So you become extremely careful. You want to know how careful? These are some of the instructions. A synagogue roll must be written on the skins of clean animals prepared for particular use of the synagogues by a Jew. They must be fastened together with strings taken from clean and must contain a certain number of columns equal throughout the entire codex. Now you see why I told you about the columns. The length of each column must not extend over less than 48 or more than 60 lines. You have a certain amount you can write on. The whole copy must be first lined, and if 3 lines be written in without a line, it's worthless. Interesting. The ink should be black, neither red, green, nor any other color, and be prepared according to a definite recipe. They cook their own ink in a certain way. An authentic copy must be exemplar, from which the transcriber ought not in the least to deviate. No word or letter or even a yod, which is an itty bitty little crook at the beginning of a word, must be written from memory. The scribe, not having looked at the codex before him, in other words, don't try to remember what you thought it said, write down what it says. And between every consonant, a space of a hair or a thread must intervene. Between every word, the breadth of a narrow consonant. Between every book, 3 lines. The book of Moses must terminate exactly with a line. Way to the end, but the rest don't have to. They held special reverence for the books of Moses. And so you find this very special, intricate way of having to do this. This is what, if you're going to copy the Bible to where it's available to someone else, you want to make sure it's perfect. You want to make sure it really does reflect what the words of God are. And they took great care to do this. Any scroll that did not match any of this was burned. Not kept, not reused, burned. Why don't you have 1,000 manuscripts? Because most of them went up in smoke. We don't know what was done. The reason for that is a group of people called the Masoretes. Now, the Masoretes were interesting folks. They spent 1,000 years making sure the Old Testament was copied accurately in a way that could be used by future generations. Today, when we open the Bible that has the Old Testament, the Masoretes are responsible for making sure that was accurate. They come from northern Israel, somewhere around Galilee. This is about the places where Jesus would have walked. And Mount Carmel's up there. Haifa, which was Joppa, it was up there. Tiberias is not far away, and neither is Nazareth. They get their name from a Hebrew word that says the authoritative traditions, Masorah. And they said, we're going to depend on the things that are most ancient, not on things that are newest. They were the guardians of the law, if you will. They looked at it and they said, we have to make sure that what God said is preserved in a way that people in the future generations can read it and understand it. They were very, very precise in what they did. We owe a lot of things to the Masoretes. Most of the things we don't think about are there. They believe this highly. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. They believed if the light was dim, the ink was bad, the way would be lost. If you eliminate the light, you eliminate the way to see. Don't we all agree with that? That's what we all believe, and yet they were putting it into practice on a daily basis, copying the text of the New Testament, the Old Testament. Now, a little bit about Hebrew. You have to understand some of this. I'm not going to teach you any Hebrew except just a few little things. But the first thing you need to understand is Hebrew is a spoken language, very oral. It wasn't written for a long time. Or if it was written, it's written a different way than you and I think about it. They had a way of hearing it and maintaining it. You think about it. If I were to give you 3 minutes worth of text and I read it to you and asked you to recite that back to me after one reading, you probably couldn't do it. I couldn't. The reason is because we have not trained our ears to listen like they did. If we say, give me what it says and I'll read it and I'll study it, they didn't have it. They were depending on what they could hear and assimilate. The same thing's happening today, by the way. Studies have shown us that people who have grown up only with GPS, they have no earthly idea. I can way with that. You give them a map, and they go, "What's this? I need the instructions." There's a whole generation beyond facial recognition at all. Just imagine, 30 years from now, if we get active breath all these days, people go, "I didn't think well. My GPS could work." Isn't that going to be great? That's exactly what's happening to us today. As a kid, they can hear it, they get absorb it, and they can recite it. There's a statement in Psalm 119 about how it is in my heart. There's more reality than that than you can imagine. The spoken language is not literary. You're literary. Right? It's spoken that people can hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is God. Heard, not read. And so just a short lesson. There are all verbs on that. You want to make a noun, you make it a participle. With prefix and suffixes on it, but everything with letter, three-letter words. Think about how many other things. There were no vowels. And if you don't have vowels, something happens, doesn't it? And all the letters start to look alike. Those are 4 different letters, by the way. Do they all look alike, sort of? Everything but right here, right here, right here, and right here. If you don't have a vowel, which letter is which? How do you know what to say? It's going to get more complicated, by the way. Just to give you an example of this, read through that. First paragraph is enough. What does that say? What is that? Not the declaration. Gettysburg. How hard was it to see that? Did you just naturally do it? Would it have been better had I done that? Think about how hard it must have been. They were used to that. They just read along. They go, okay, I understand what that word is. You go, yeah, but what is it? There's no vowel to it. Now, there are some languages where consonants and vowels are sparsely used. And for instance, I always was fascinated by the Duke basketball coach, Mike Krzyzewski. Everything's a constant in that word, that one letter. How do you say that? It's all constant. No, it's the same thing here. And the way you made a noun was to make it a verb into a noun. Now we do that today. When I was in the previous place I was down the Gulf Coast, um, I was friends with the preachers and the workers at the black church across town in Texas City, and I would get their bulletin every week. And something fascinating caught my eye one day. It said on Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock, we're going to funeralize Mabel Smith. Funeralize. Funeralize? I didn't know that was a word. They made it one. You take the noun and you make it into a verb by adding IZE. So you funeralize people. Ever since that time, I have had a trouble if I'm talking about a funeral without saying, we're going to funeralize them on Friday. I could really stump the panel on that one, I think. But that's kind of the way it was there as well. This gives us a problem, too. By the way, which is correct? Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuchadrezzar? Which one did you learn? The first one. Did you know that really it's the last one? Because of the way you read all the consonants is different. Now, that's a real problem. Now, I've had people argue with this, by the way. They go, no, that's not right. You misspelled it. And they always will go to the King James Version and say, see, I found it here. Well, I've got answers for that next week, so you have to come back. So what do they do to help in all of this? This is an interesting problem. The Masoretes did some interesting things that have allowed us to be able to understand the Old Testament better, to be able to read it and see what it really said, and to make sure it's accurate. They made accuracy a touchstone. You're going to make every copy that they made absolutely perfect. No slip-ups, no scribal errors. They're going to make sure that if there's a mistake, it doesn't see the light of day. That's hard to do. Do you remember what it used to be like when you used to type? I do. There was a time, long before the computer came about, was that we had about 3 different mechanisms with this, and it never did work well. One, you could have erasable paper. You ever use erasable paper? Most worthless thing in the world. It erases once and then the hole's there. And so it's done. The other thing was whiteout. I can't tell you how many times I went, so I could correct an error. And then there used to be the little slips of white paper. And the problem with that was you never got it lined up just right. So you always had an outline. And no matter what happened, so when they made self-correction in Selectric, IBM Select, that was great, man. That was fabulous. You know, I had to literally type my fixes 4 times because if you made a mistake, you had to fix that mistake. And if you fix that mistake, it would throw the rest of the pages off. I hate that. Some of it I had to go to Abilene to use a Hebrew typewriter. What a mess. The way they did it, though, was they had the count. They were the ultimate first accountant, but they didn't count money. They counted words. Now, this is John 1, 1 to 14. What's the middle word of that passage? What's that? Okay, how'd you get that? You guessed right, and probably because it's in the right column. That's the middle word, of that passage. The way I had to do it was count the words. Now, if you had to do that every time you did a manuscript, you'd be in trouble, wouldn't you? But you can do that. Now, by the way, um, you can run it through AI. It'll tell you sort of, not great. Um, but did you know that the middle verse of the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis to Deuteronomy, is Leviticus 8 and verse 7? That's the middle verse. We know that because Masoretes put this little notation right there that told you that's the middle verse. So if they're copying a manuscript and they come to that little part and it's verse 6 or verse 8, it gets burned and you start over again. Think about how bad that might be. How many people would want the job of a scribe? I don't think I would. But they knew exactly. They could count it and say, here it is. If it didn't hit here, we got it wrong there. It could be, but they usually had several people counting at the same time, and they formalized over a while. The middle verse of the Hebrew Bible is Jeremiah 6 and verse 7. That's what that means right there. Middle verse, Hebrew Bible. Now, the Hebrew Bible is not put together the way the English Bible is. I did run that through AI. I was not going to count every word in the Old Testament. So I ran an AI study, and the best they could give me was somewhere around Psalm 103, 1 or 2. So much for intelligence, artificial or otherwise. But they knew exactly where it was. And so they had a checker, and they could check and see. Because they did that, they also wanted to make sure that when people started reading, and by the way, by the time of the first and second century, reading became primary function. You had to have a reason. You didn't know what he was going to say. Yes, that's right. That's right. They count the letters, find out where the middle of it is. It's to a certain end of a line. You did not, for instance, their verses, if you remember that statement, when they came to the end of the verse, they started another line. So they knew where the line breaks were. Now, when you get to Greek, that's a whole other area, but that's what they did, and that's how they could use their eyes to do that, and that worked out okay. But if you didn't have any vowels, how do you read? Would you like to read things like the Gettysburg Address without vowels all day long? Wouldn't your eyes get tired? Mine would be. They really did, and they didn't have one. I mean, I still look back and back in the 70s, I would have given anything to have a computer, so I wasn't even typing on an electric typewriter anymore. I doubt they did. I mean, if you were to ask me in 1974, would one of these days this be easier? And my answer would have been no. We got the best it's going to ever get. And that'd be my answer. You know, if I'm using a IBM Selectric typewriter, man, that was the Cadillac of the deal, man. There's not going to be anything better than this. You can change the fonts, you can change, boy, it's just great. You know, it's got a lot better than that, or worse, depending on your viewpoints. Well, what if you're going to be reading? What if a person, just a person, not a rabbi, is going to read? How would you going to read if it doesn't have vowels to it? This got to be kind of critical because I want to show you this. At the very bottom of this text are these two letters. Do they look alike? Did you know they're not alike? The one on the right is a letter called shin. The letter on the left is a letter called sin. They create a different word. So if you use one and not the other, by the way, there's that the best place to see this in the Old Testament is where they come to the people and they ask them to say the word, to say the shibboleth. And if they say Sibboleth, because they can't pronounce it, they must not be of God. Okay? That's why I'm good. I'm glad you did that. I did not pay you to be my shill, but that's exactly what I wanted somebody to ask. How do you tell the difference? Well, the difference is the Masoretes said we will put a dot over here on a sin and a dot over here on a shin. They're differentiating letters. And when you look at the differential letters, you go, I don't think that makes any difference. But look at this. Look at all these dots and stuff. That doesn't mean they let the chicken run through the ink and then get on the page. That's what it kind of looks like. Just somebody kind of splattered a little ink over there and they didn't wipe it all up. But every one of those little points means something. Every last one of them. And you see, here's that letter, by the way. Well, that's not the same one. But if you just look at all the little dots. All those little dots mean something. And it really came to bear when you start talking about the name of God. The name of God comes out of Exodus chapter 3. In Exodus 3, Moses is before the burning bush making his excuses. One of his excuses is, who shall I say has sent me? I don't even know your name. God says, I'll tell you what my name is. My name is I am who I am. All that's captured in those 4 Hebrew letters. You want to know what they are? They're a Yah, a Hey, a Vav, and a Hey. It's the 4 letters called the Tetragrammaton. And the Tetragrammaton was the word you did not say. In English, it probably comes over as Yahweh, but in Hebrew, it's the word you did not say, lest you mispronounced it, because if you mispronounce it, it's blasphemy. It's the misuse of the name of God. It violates the 10 Commandments. You could be stoned for that. So nobody said that word. They had it, nobody said it. They come along in the text, and when they come along in the text, they would take these consonants, and then they would add vowels from another word for God. It really means Lord, Adonai. And so when the King James Version came out, they had done that for so long that they took that and put it into English, and it became the word Jehovah. Jehovah is not a real word. It is a word with some other letters hooked to it to make it sound like that, to be acceptable, to make sure you don't mess it up. Now, in English, we come across this somehow. This is the New American Standard Bible. And if you'll notice in Deuteronomy, for instance, every time you have the word Lord that's capitalized, that's the Yahweh. We still have that coming over. You'll never find Yahweh in an English text. You'll find it like this. Deuteronomy 5 and verse 6 says, I am the Lord your God. One that Moses talked about. I am the Lord your God. And I am the Lord your God. Oh, constantly. It's there in all versions because they're preserving something that was real at one time. And there's still that sense of reverence. You don't say that word, but you still don't say that word. And that's a problem because if you don't say a word, you forget how it's pronounced. I can't remember a word that I can't pronounce because I've forgotten how to pronounce it years ago. Now, if that hadn't confused you enough, we still got more to do. How do we know this is accurate? Because other sources, when they use these texts, confirm exactly the wording that's been said in these 10th century documents. The Talmud, for instance, is a collection of all Jewish rituals and rules, like 156,000 pages. It rivals the tax code of the United States. But when it refers to the Old Testament and the Scripture, it has exactly the way that we read it. The same is said about the Aramaic Targums. Now, they're from 100 to 500 AD. They do exactly the same thing. Jerome's Vulgate which any of those manuscripts I showed you will confirm that as well, as will the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, about 250. We'll talk about that next week, I think. But those things they confirm everything that was there. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, a little shepherd boy, a Bedouin shepherd, was tending sheep out by the Dead Sea. Why anybody had sheep by the Dead Sea, I have no idea, but they had. Apparently that was the only safe place to find the grass. But up on the cliffs above the Dead Sea, he was wandering around looking at sheep, and he got bored. And so, like any boy, he picked up a rock, chunked it into a cave, and suddenly heard this crash. Now, that's a different sound. So he goes in to find out what it was. He goes in there, and he has broken a pot, one among dozens and dozens. And when he looks into it, there is this very, very old scroll. It's very old. And every pot has the same thing. So he doesn't know what to do. He runs home and tells his dad. His dad knows an antiquity dealer in the local town. You know what antiquity dealers do? They do two things. They sell good stuff on the black market and sell bad stuff. That's what an antiquity dealer does in ancient Near East. And the antiquity dealer, when he examines it, realized how valuable they were and how important they were. So he called a rabbi that he knew, and the rabbi confirmed that these indeed were extremely old. They are so old that they go back to around 150 BC. Notice how close that is to the events. They come from a group called the Essenes. The Essenes were they were kind of hermits. They wanted to get away from the impurities of Jewish society. They felt the Jewish society was going too Greek, too Roman, too worse, like a lot of people today feel. And so they're going to move out in the desert where nobody bothers. A good place to go if you don't want people to bother you is in the Dead Sea. Nobody goes out there. It's too hot, too dry. That's why the scrolls are preserved well. And they found that from the Essenes, by the way, some people believe John the Baptist was an Essene because he wore camel's hair and ate honey. I don't think that. I think that's a big stretch based upon small reference, but that's just me. But it has these have fragments of every book in the Old Testament, but most of them are from Isaiah and Habakkuk. Why? Because those ones talk about the end of the world, the end of the age. They were big into the end of the world stuff too, like we are today. You think the world's going to end tomorrow? Well, we got these passages to say so. And so they were big into that. And they go back to 100 BC. And there's some small and insignificant spelling differences, but not many. And so they have been done quite well. Today, the scrolls are kept in Jerusalem in a museum in which, if you'll notice, they are put together in a round. That's the round, by the way. It looks like a scroll. Top looks like the top of a jar. Now, 12 years ago, I was on vacation around Christmas time, and they had an exhibit of the Dead Sea Scroll at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary for work. I decided I'm going to go. So I make the long trek over South Fort Worth to go to the seminary. And there they have this wonderful exhibit, by the way. They had a diorama of what the Essenes, how they would have lived, and they had what they would have done to copy all this stuff. And then, but the big part was at the end where you could see the Dead Sea Scroll. You know how much you saw? About this big. Just behind 4 panes of glass. Every 5 minutes, a light would come on for 45 seconds. And so when the light came on, it was like bats heading out to the cave. All of a sudden, wow, there's the lights on. We got to go look at it. And you look at it, and it's a itty bitty little thing. And you go, and this is what I paid for? Until you realize that these things are 2,000 years old. These are the words of Scripture written on the paper. It's fascinating to think about that. And so what was the impact on it? Did it change anything? The truth is it didn't change. This is 1947, by the way. Plenty of translations of the Bible had come out since then, or before that. But what we learned was it does not change our view of what's in that text. It only confirms it. So when we read the pages of the Old Testament, we find out that what was written there was what God intended to be written there. And there is no changing, no altering as things go on.